Somewhere in Morocco, there's a skull that scientists genuinely do not know what to call. It has a face almost exactly like yours, but the back of that skull is long and low, more like something you'd expect from a Neanderthal. It's dated to roughly 300,000 years old. And it might be one of the very first members of our species that ever existed. So if this thing existed 300,000 years ago, why does almost everything interesting about being human, art, language, cities, religion, only show up in roughly the last tiny sliver of that timeline? Something was walking around looking human for 250,000 years before it started acting like it. So when did we actually become human? First, we're going to figure out when the human body showed up. Then, we're going to look at when the human mind showed up. For decades, the story of human origins pointed to East Africa. Fossils found there, dated to around 195,000 years old, were treated as the earliest solid evidence of our species. Then, in 2017, a research team led by paleoanthropologist Jean-Jacques Hublin went back to a site in Morocco called Jebel Irhoud. Fossils had actually been sitting there since the 1960s, originally misidentified as ancient Neanderthals. Using better dating technology, the team redated them. The result rewrote the timeline by 100,000 years. These fossils were roughly 300,000 years old, and they showed something genuinely strange. The face was modern, flat, delicate, essentially indistinguishable from yours. But the brain case behind that face was long and archaic, closer in shape to older, more primitive human relatives. In other words, the face arrived before the brain finished catching up. Researchers have a name for this pattern: mosaic evolution. Instead of a full package of human traits appearing all at once, different features show up on their own separate timelines, get bolted onto the same skeleton in stages. And not everyone agrees these fossils should even count as full Homo sapiens. Paleoanthropologist John Hawkes has openly pushed back on that classification, arguing the researchers may be stretching the label further than the evidence supports. Even the scientists working in this exact field can't fully agree on where to draw the line for our own species. So if you're looking for the single moment the human body appeared, you already have a real problem. The best fossil candidate for the first human doesn't look fully human by everyone's standards, and it showed up at a moment when at least one other, very different, small-brained hominin species, Homo naledi, was apparently still walking around in southern Africa at roughly the same time. Two very different-looking hominins, overlapping timelines, same continent. The body took a long, messy road to arrive, and the body arriving is only half the story. Because for a huge stretch of time after these fossils, whoever these people were, weren't doing anything we'd recognize as culture. If the human body existed roughly 300,000 years ago, you'd expect signs of a human mind to show up not too long after. Tools, sure, but also art, symbols, jewelry, evidence that someone somewhere was thinking about meaning, not just survival. That evidence doesn't show up for a very long time. The earliest strong evidence for symbolic thought comes from a site called Blombo's Cave on the southern coast of South Africa. Researchers led by archaeologist Christopher Henshelwood have been excavating there since the 1990s, and what they found reshaped the entire debate about when the human mind actually switched on. At around 100,000 years old, the cave contains the oldest known evidence of humans deliberately mixing and storing paint, using abalone shells as containers. At roughly 75,000 years old, the site yields dozens of small shell beads, deliberately pierced and likely worn as jewellery, alongside pieces of ochre engraved with deliberate repeated crosshatch patterns. And more recently, researchers identified an even older fragment at the site, dated to about 73,000 years ago. bearing what's now considered the oldest known abstract drawing made by a human hand. None of that is decoration for its own sake. Jewelry signals identity to other people. Abstract patterns require holding a plan in your head and executing it deliberately. This is symbolic thought, the same fundamental capability behind language, money, flags, and religion, showing up in the archaeological record tens of thousands of years earlier than scientists used to assume. For a long time, the dominant idea, championed by paleoanthropologist Richard Klein, was that modern human behaviour appeared suddenly, almost like a switch flipping somewhere around 50,000 years ago, possibly triggered by a single genetic mutation that rewired the brain for advanced language and abstract thought. It's sometimes called the Great Leap Forward hypothesis. Dramatic, clean, easy to put in a documentary, the discoveries at Blombos and similar sites across Africa badly damaged that idea. Researchers Sally McBurty and Alison Brooks published an influential, extensively cited paper in 2000 directly challenging Klein's model. Their argument, often summarized as the revolution that wasn't, is that modern human behavior didn't arrive in one sudden leap at all. It built up gradually in fits and starts across Africa, over hundreds of thousands of years, region by region, tradition by tradition, long before anything like it shows up in Europe. So the honest current answer to when did the human mind switch on isn't a single date. It's more like a slow, dimmer switch, with different communities in different regions reaching that threshold at genuinely different times. We've been treating Homo sapiens like a clean, sealed category. You're either in it or you're not. But the deeper you dig into the genetics, the blurrier that boundary gets. Genetic studies over the last 2 decades have confirmed something remarkable. Ancestors of most people alive today interbred with Neanderthals, and separately with another group called Denisovans, known mostly from a handful of bone fragments and teeth found in Siberia. Most non-African populations today carry measurable percentages of Neanderthal DNA in their genome. Some populations in parts of Asia and Oceania carry meaningful amounts of Denisovan DNA too, some of which appears to have provided real, practical advantages, including genetic variants tied to surviving at extreme high altitude. So the species boundary that sounds so definitive in textbooks was, in practice, leaky. Different human-like populations were living alongside each other, sometimes overlapping for tens of thousands of years, and at least occasionally having children together. Which brings us back to the original question with a much stranger edge to it. If the body showed up in stages, if the mind switched on gradually at different times in different places, and if the species boundary itself was blurry enough to interbreed across, then when did humans become human might be the wrong kind of question entirely. It assumes there's one clean line to find, when the actual evidence points to something closer to a long overlapping gradient, with no single sunrise moment anywhere on it. So let's actually answer it. When did humans become human? The body arrived first, in pieces, roughly 300,000 years ago, wearing a face you'd recognize immediately, attached to a brain that hadn't finished catching up. The mind arrived far more slowly and far more unevenly, with clear evidence of symbolic thought stretching back, at least 100,000 years, quietly building, for tens of thousands of years before anything like a sudden switch occurred. And the species line separating us from not us turns out to have been porous enough that a meaningful chunk of your own DNA can be traced straight back through it. You weren't the result of one dramatic breakthrough. You're the result of thousands of smaller ones stacked on top of each other unevenly over an almost incomprehensible span of time, which honestly might be the most human thing about the whole story. Nothing about us arrived all at once. It never has. So what will humans evolve to next?